The morning sun had barely peeked over the Los Angeles skyline when Captain Lee walked through the sliding doors of LAX Terminal 4. The familiar smell of coffee and jet fuel filled the air as she made her way through the crew entrance, rolling her small black suitcase behind her. She'd done this walk thousands of times in her 15 years as a commercial pilot, but something about today felt different. She spotted her co-pilot, Mr. Singh, already going through the pre-flight checklist in the crew room. "Morning, started without me?" she said with a smile, hanging up her jacket. Mr. Singh looked up from his papers and grinned, "Just trying to stay ahead of schedule. Weather looks perfect all the way to Chicago." Flight PA 247 was scheduled for a 7:30 am departure, and the boarding process had started smoothly. The usual mix of passengers filed in: business travelers in crisp suits tapping away on their laptops, families carolling excited children, and tourists ready for their Chicago adventures. But what caught the flight attendants' attention was a group of 6 men in leather vests, covered in patches and badges of their motorcycle club. As Captain Lee performed her final walk-around inspection of the Boeing 737, she overheard 2 ground crew members whispering about the bikers. "Hope they don't cause any trouble," one said. "I heard they were pretty rowdy in the terminal." She made a mental note but didn't think much of it. In her years of flying, she'd seen all types of passengers, and most concerns turned out to be nothing. Back in the cockpit, she went through her pre-flight routine with practiced precision. Each switch, each dial, each system check was like a familiar dance. The head flight attendant, Mrs. Patel, popped her head in. "Full flight today, Captain. 178 passengers, including 6 gentlemen from the Steel Dragons Motorcycle Club in rows 15 and 16. Captain Lee nodded, appreciating Mrs. Patel's subtle way of keeping her informed. "Thanks, let's give them our usual warm welcome." She'd learned long ago that treating everyone with respect, regardless of appearance or background, often prevented problems before they could start. As the last passengers settled in, she picked up the intercom. "Good morning, everyone. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 247 to Chicago O'Hare. We're looking at clear skies and smooth sailing today, with an estimated flight time of 4 hours and 15 minutes. The temperature in Chicago is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please make yourselves comfortable and don't hesitate to let our excellent cabin crew know if you need anything." The engines hummed to life, and the morning sun cast long shadows as they taxied toward the runway. Captain Lee felt the familiar surge of joy as the plane lifted off the ground, Los Angeles sprawling out below them in the golden morning light. Little did she know that this routine flight was about to become one of the most memorable of her career. As they reached cruising altitude, she heard the first call button chime, then another, and another. The first signs that this wouldn't be just another routine flight to Chicago were starting to appear, like distant storm clouds on an otherwise clear horizon. The first hour of the flight passed quietly enough. The Steel Dragons kept to themselves, though their deep laughs occasionally echoed through the cabin. It wasn't until the drink service began that things started to shift. The 6 men, spread across 2 rows, had already been sharing stories and jokes, their voices growing progressively louder. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out to a passing flight attendant. "How about making this flight more interesting?" He held up an empty cup, ice cubes rattling. The flight attendant, Mrs. Patel, maintained her professional smile. "Sir, I'll be happy to serve you another beverage when I reach your row." But that wasn't enough for them. As Mrs. Patel moved through the cabin with her cart, the bikers' comments grew more frequent and less appropriate. Other passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A young mother 3 rows ahead pulled her headphones out, keeping one eye on the situation while trying to distract her children with a tablet. "Come on, darling, don't be like that," another biker called out when Mrs. Patel politely declined to serve him a 4th drink. "We're just trying to have some fun." His leather vest creaked as he leaned into the aisle, blocking her path. An elderly couple in row 14 exchanged worried glances. The husband pressed his call button, and when another flight attendant responded, they quietly requested to be moved to different seats. They weren't the only ones. Several other passengers had started making similar requests. The tension in the cabin was building like pressure in a shaken soda can. 2 businessmen who had been trying to work on their laptops finally gave up, the constant disruption making it impossible to concentrate. A college student who had been sleeping woke up to the commotion, pulling out her earbuds with an annoyed expression. "You know what I think?" The largest of the bikers announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I think airlines these days are too uptight. Back in the good old days, flying was fun." His friends nodded in agreement, their voices getting even louder as they shared stories about the good old days. Mrs. Patel and her colleague, Mr. Kim, tried their best to manage the situation. They approached the group several times with gentle reminders about airline policies and consideration for other passengers. Each time, the bikers would settle down for a few minutes before starting up again, their behavior becoming more defiant with each interaction. A young teacher chaperoning a group of high school students returning from a science competition kept glancing nervously at the bikers. She had moved her students closer together, away from the disturbance, but the tension was clearly affecting everyone. In the cockpit, Captain Lee and Mr. Singh could hear the increasing commotion through their cabin monitor. They exchanged concerned looks as more call buttons chimed. Through their headsets, they could hear the strain in Mrs. Patel's voice as she radioed for advice on handling the situation. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from the usual drowsy calm of a morning flight to something more like a pressure cooker. Other passengers were now openly staring at the bikers, some with worry, others with obvious irritation. The usual white noise of the engines seemed to amplify the tension, like a bass note underlying an increasingly discordant symphony. What nobody knew yet was that this situation was about to reach a breaking point, and Captain Lee would need to make a decision that would change everyone's lives. At least for the next few hours. The real test of her leadership wasn't just flying the plane, it was about to become managing what was happening behind that cockpit door. The situation reached its boiling point 2 hours into the flight. One of the bikers, the one with a silver skull ring on each finger, pulled out a cigarette and started reaching for his pocket. The entire cabin seemed to freeze, watching in disbelief. "Sir," Mr. Kim approached quickly, his voice firm but professional. "Smoking is strictly prohibited on all flights. I need you to put that away immediately." The biker looked up slowly, a smirk playing across his face. "Come on, man. One little smoke won't hurt anyone." He twirled the unlit cigarette between his fingers, clearly enjoying the attention. "I'm sorry, but this is a federal regulation. If you light that cigarette, we'll have to take serious action." Mr. Kim stood his ground, though his hands were slightly shaking. A business executive in a navy blue suit, who had been watching the scene unfold while pretending to read his magazine, finally spoke up. "Excuse me," he said, turning in his seat. "We're all trying to have a peaceful flight. Would you mind following the rules?" The cabin went even quieter, if that was possible. The bikers all turned to stare at the businessman, their expressions darkening. The leader, a tall man with a gray beard, stood up despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. "And who exactly asked for your opinion?" he growled, taking a step toward the businessman's seat. His friends started standing up too, forming an intimidating wall in the narrow aisle. A teenager a few rows back started recording with his phone, but his mother quickly made him stop. An off-duty nurse shifted in her seat, clearly torn between helping and staying out of it. The young teacher with her students had gone pale, positioning herself protectively between the bikers and her kids. Mrs. Patel rushed to the intercom and called the cockpit. "Captain," she whispered urgently, "we have a situation." She quickly explained what was happening, her voice trembling slightly. In the cockpit, Captain Lee listened intently, her experienced hands steady on the controls as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Mr. Singh looked at her with concern, waiting to see how she would handle this escalating crisis. Most captains would have made the standard decision, divert to the nearest airport, have law enforcement waiting, end of story. But Captain Lee sat quietly for a moment, thinking. She had seen something in the bikers' behavior that others might have missed. Behind their tough act, she had noticed how they responded to authority, not with outright defiance, but with a kind of testing attitude, like teenagers pushing boundaries. She reached into her personal bag, pulling out a worn envelope she always kept there. Inside was something that might just change the whole dynamic of this situation. It was a risk, breaking from standard protocol, but sometimes the best solutions weren't found in any manual. "Tell Mrs. Patel to come to the cockpit," she told Mr. Singh, "and ask Mr. Kim to hold position but not escalate things." I have an idea. As Mrs. Patel hurried to the cockpit, the tension in the cabin continued to build. The businessmen had fallen silent, but the bikers remained standing, daring anyone else to challenge them. Other passengers were pretending to sleep or stare out windows, trying to become invisible while stealing nervous glances at the unfolding scene. What happened next would leave everyone on board with a story they'd tell for years to come. Captain Lee was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful way to handle a crisis isn't with force or threats, but with something entirely unexpected. Captain Lee's voice came through the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm turning on the fasten seatbelt sign as we're expecting some turbulence ahead." The timing was perfect, not a lie, but a way to get everyone seated without escalating the situation. The bikers hesitated, their tough facade wavering slightly at the authority in her voice, but they remained standing, trying to save face. The leader crossed his arms, his leather vest creaking. "We'll sit when we're good and ready," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. That's when Mrs. Patel emerged from the cockpit. She carried something in her hands, a photograph and what looked like some kind of military ID card. She walked directly to the group of bikers, her steps purposeful but not aggressive. "The captain asked me to show you something," she said quietly, holding out the items. The bikers looked at each other, confused. Their leader took the photo, and his expression changed instantly. The photograph showed a younger Captain Lee in full combat gear, standing beside a military helicopter in a dusty desert landscape. Her face was streaked with sand and determination, her posture radiating quiet confidence. Next to the photo was her Marine Corps ID and a combat service ribbon. 3 tours, Mrs. Patel explained softly. She flew combat rescue missions in Afghanistan. That helicopter behind her? She landed it under heavy fire to save a trapped unit. The captain wanted you to know that she respects riders she actually used to ride herself. But more importantly, she wants you to understand that she's handled much tougher situations than this, and she'd rather not have to divert the flight and get authorities involved. The cabin had gone completely silent. You could hear the engine hum and feel the subtle vibrations of the plane, but every passenger seemed to be holding their breath. The teenager who had tried to record earlier was now sitting up straight, completely captivated by the scene. The biker leader studied the photo for a long moment. His friends crowded around to look, their expressions shifting from defiance to something else, respect, maybe even a bit of embarrassment. The skull rings glinted as he carefully handed the photo back to Mrs. Patel. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice notably softer, "please tell the captain we appreciate her sharing this with us." And he paused, looking around at the cabin full of nervous passengers. "We apologize for causing any trouble." One by one, the bikers sat down. The one with the cigarette pulled it out of his mouth and tucked it away in his pocket. Another one who had been particularly loud earlier now sat quietly, staring out the window. The change in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. It was as if someone had released a valve, letting all the tension hiss away into the high-altitude air. The businessman who had spoken up earlier relaxed his grip on his armrest. The young mother ahead stopped, nervously checking over her shoulder. The teacher and her students exchanged relieved smiles. Mrs. Patel nodded graciously and headed back toward the galley. As she passed the businessman's row, she heard one of the bikers say quietly to his friends, "You know, my uncle was a Marine. Tough as they come. If she's anything like him." In the cockpit, Captain Lee allowed herself a small smile as Mrs. Patel reported back. She had gambled on something she'd learned long ago. Sometimes the best way to earn respect is to show respect first. By sharing a piece of her story rather than throwing around her authority, she had given the bikers a way to back down while keeping their dignity. The next hour of the flight showed a remarkable transformation. The same bikers who had been causing chaos were now model passengers. The leader had even apologized personally to Mr. Kim about the cigarette incident, explaining that he'd gotten carried away trying to show off for his friends. What happened next surprised everyone. The biker with the skull rings noticed the young teacher struggling to get her student's carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, he stood up and offered to help. "Let me get that for you, ma'am," he said, easily lifting the heavy bag down. The teacher's initial nervousness melted into a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, "that's very kind." Her students watched the interaction with wide eyes, perhaps learning a valuable lesson about not judging books by their covers. The elderly couple who had asked to move seats earlier were now engaged in a friendly conversation with another member of the group. It turned out the biker had a grandmother back home who he visited every Sunday for dinner. They were swapping stories about family traditions and comparing notes on the best recipes for apple pie. Even the businessman who had spoken up earlier found himself drawn into a surprisingly civil discussion about motorcycle restoration. One of the bikers was explaining how he'd rebuilt a vintage 1960s bike from scratch, his eyes lighting up with genuine passion as he described the process. Mrs. Patel and Mr. Kim exchanged amazed glances as they moved through the cabin with their regular service. The atmosphere had completely shifted from tense and hostile to something almost festive. Other passengers who had been shrinking in their seats were now relaxed, some even joining in the various conversations that had sprung up. The young mother ahead turned around to thank the bikers for quieting down and ended up showing them pictures of her kids' first bicycle rides. "You know," said one of the bikers, pulling out his phone, "my daughter just learned to ride too. Look at this video." In the cockpit, Captain Lee listened to the happy murmur of voices through the cabin monitor. Mr. Singh shook his head in admiration. "In all my years of flying," he said, "I've never seen anything quite like this. How did you know it would work?" Captain Lee adjusted their course slightly, checking the weather radar before responding. "Sometimes people just need to be reminded of their better selves," she said. "Those men aren't bad people, they just got caught up in playing a role they thought they had to play." The remainder of the flight passed smoothly, with the bikers even helping the flight attendants collect trash before landing. When the plane hit some light turbulence, they were the first to make sure their seatbelts were fastened, setting an example for the other passengers. As they began their descent into Chicago, the setting sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and pink. The same cabin that had been filled with tension hours earlier now buzzed with the warm energy of shared stories and newfound connections. The college student who had been rudely awakened earlier was now fast asleep, peaceful and undisturbed. The teacher's students were excitedly discussing their science competition with one of the younger bikers who turned out to have a degree in engineering. Even the plane seemed to be flying more smoothly, as if reflecting the harmony that had developed among its passengers. As the plane began its final approach to O'Hare International Airport, the mood in the cabin was completely different from a few hours ago. The evening light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the passengers who had become unlikely friends during this memorable flight. The biker leader stood up one last time, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. "Before we land," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin, "I'd like to say something." He looked around at the faces watching him, faces that had shown fear earlier but now showed curiosity and warmth. "My friends and I," he gestured to his fellow bikers, "we owe all of you an apology, especially our flight attendants and that brave businessman who spoke up." He paused, adjusting his leather vest. "We got caught up in trying to be tough guys and forgot something important. Respect isn't about making others fear you, it's about earning their trust." The businessman nodded in acknowledgement, a slight smile on his face. Mrs. Patel wiped a tear from her eye as she secured the galley for landing. The other passengers listened intently, many nodding in agreement. "That photo the captain shared," the biker continued, his voice growing softer, "it reminded me of my own brother who served. He always said the real heroes aren't the ones who make the most noise, but the ones who quietly do what needs to be done." He looked toward the cockpit. "We've got a real hero flying this plane, and we acted like fools." The young mother who had been so worried earlier spoke up. "We all make mistakes," she said kindly. "It's how we fix them that matters." Her children nodded vigorously, making everyone chuckle. The elderly gentleman who had shared apple pie recipes added, "In my experience, it takes a bigger person to admit they're wrong than to pretend they're always right." His wife patted his hand, smiling at the bikers. As the plane descended through the clouds, the city lights of Chicago twinkling below, Mr. Kim made his final cabin check. The same bikers who had given him such a hard time now made sure their seats were upright and their belts were fastened without being asked. The teacher used the moment as a lesson for her students. "See," she whispered to them. "This is what real strength looks like, being able to change and grow." The students watched as the tough-looking bikers helped nearby passengers stow their belongings properly for landing. Captain Lee's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making our final approach to Chicago O'Hare. The local time is 6:45 p.m., and the temperature is a beautiful 70 degrees. I want to thank you all for making this one of the most memorable flights of my career." There was something in her voice, a warmth, a hint of pride perhaps, that made everyone smile. The same voice that had commanded respect hours ago now carried a note of genuine appreciation for how things had turned out. As the wheels touched down on the runway with a gentle bump, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. But it wasn't just the usual clapping for a smooth landing. It was appreciation for something more, for a journey that had become about much more than just getting from Los Angeles to Chicago. The plane taxied to the gate as the last rays of sunlight faded from the Chicago sky. As passengers began gathering their belongings, something unusual happened. Instead of the usual rush to be first off the plane, everyone seemed to linger, as if reluctant to end this extraordinary journey. The bikers waited patiently, helping others get their bags from the overhead bins. The leader stopped at the businessman's row. "Hey," he said, extending his hand, "thanks for having the courage to speak up earlier. You were right, and we were wrong." The businessman shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for showing us all that it's never too late to change course," he replied with a genuine smile. As passengers finally began to deplane, many stopped by the cockpit door where Captain Lee now stood, greeting everyone with a warm smile. The young teacher brought her whole group of students by. "Thank you for teaching them such a valuable lesson today," she said, one they couldn't learn from any textbook. The elderly couple paused too. "Young lady," the wife said to the captain, "in our 50 years of flying, we've never seen anything quite like this. You handled it beautifully." Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "You reminded us all that there's more to people than what we see on the surface." When the bikers reached the front of the plane, they stopped. Their leader looked at Captain Lee with deep respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we owe you an apology and our thanks. You could have had us arrested, but instead, you showed us respect we hadn't earned. We won't forget that." The captain smiled. "The great thing about respect," she replied, "is that it works both ways. You proved that by choosing to change your behavior. That takes real courage." As the last passengers left, Mrs. Patel and Mr. Kim gathered near the cockpit. The young mother who had been so worried earlier stopped by with her children. "My kids want to give you something, Captain," she said. The children handed over a drawing they'd made during the flight, a plane with hearts around it and the words "Best Flight Ever" in colorful crayon. 2 weeks later, the airline received an unexpected package. Inside was a leather vest with a special patch sewn onto it. The patch showed a pilot's wings with the words "Honorary Road Angel" beneath them. A note accompanied it. "For the captain who taught us that true strength isn't about being tough, but about being wise enough to bring out the best in others." The story spread through the airline industry, becoming a teaching moment in crew training sessions. But more than that, it became a reminder that even at 35,000 feet, what matters most is our shared humanity. The passengers of Flight 247 had boarded as strangers divided by appearances and assumptions. They landed as people who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful moments in life come when we're brave enough to see past our differences and find our common ground. Captain Lee kept that crayon drawing in her flight bag. On challenging days, it reminded her that leadership isn't about controlling situations, but about giving people the chance to be their best selves. And somewhere on the highways of America, 6 bikers tell this story to anyone who'll listen. The story of a pilot who taught them that real respect isn't about fear, but about understanding.